So this is a continuation of the earlier one. So what I did, something which remained unexplained in the earlier lecture, I'll try to elaborate here, so that it doesn't go, too distant, kind of a different lectures. Now, okay. Again, I go back to Mao's time to know that remember I discussed about this, how Mao was trying to and why these things are important, because you have to really understand that what happened to these social categories. So one point you got is that transformation from agrarian China to a urban-based society. So and then different categories. Now another kind of a important theme which you can get from this lecture is that the classes, what happened to why these new groups have emerged, or you can understand the social equality or social inequality, which has been also a fascination of sociologists, that what are the new forms of social inequality in China, and why these inequalities were not there in the earlier time, or if they were there, how state tried to address those inequalities. That is one. And second, how they try to, because in China it's possible, they try to reorganize the social life differently. So it is not that, so they try to change the social society so that you don't have those kind of inequalities the way you have in India, or it has changed into a new form of a social inequality. So some of these, you can understand the kind of a social inequalities we think of basically with a focus. The kind of revolution, I don't go into the association life, because I think I have said enough about the association life from the imperial time till Mao's time. And what Mao has tried to do, as I said earlier lecture also, they try to reinvent or reorganize. So reorganization of social life means that you essentially diversify or divide these groups into different categories. So you have basically peasant, labor, and women, and these are three categories you have introduced. Even in the pre-revolutionary China also, Mao has this very important land law, which talks about the land should be confiscated from the landlord and given to the peasant, and it goes down till after revolution. So because CPC has got its power because of the peasantry, so the whole idea was that how to keep peasantry happy. And what they try to do, even after revolution, immediately they pass this land reform law, which means that peasantry for the first time enjoyed independent power on the land, of course within the rubric of collectivization on that. So you have the independent power, but it doesn't mean that you use it in the way you want, rather it was very much in the form of a collectivization. So land reform measure was basically for the first one to introduce or to abolish this property-based social inequalities in China. So you can look at the social inequalities more than the earlier time. And of course, women marriage law, which I'm sure that you all know, that for the first time, women were given this freedom to marry on their own, and as well as there was some kind of property-based equality, that women also become an equal partner to a landed property. So these were some of the empowering institutions. Now, there's a whole debate of law and institutions in China. So I would say that in case of Mao's time, the laws were not a kind of an autonomous entity. Rather, the law was basically made to serve the state interest of social transformation. And this land law, marriage law basically is one example where you see that it was not simply like India, where the law is a kind of an empowering way where individual can go to the law against the state. But in case of China, the law was used for a social transformation, and land law and the marriage law was one example. And why? As I explained to you earlier also, there was no conflict in those years between the individual and the state, because state says that I will take care of everybody's interests. And how did it do it? Of course, I'll come to it. It divided the society into various classes. So class and the state, that was the two categories. There was no individual as such. So whole theory of law happened only when you have an individual as an independent category or as an autonomous entity. And that is why from the market reform onwards, you have a series of laws on various aspects. But till then, you don't have independent law as an independent political entity in China, because the society and the state, that kind of a contract was very different from the other countries. What interestingly the Chinese state did, they started this process of reinventing Chinese society. Now, something which is very interesting, that social classes in China was not something that you are born with. Rather, what the party state did, they tried to impose these social categories on the citizens. So who belongs to the poor peasantry, who belongs to the rich peasant, middle peasant, or the bourgeoisie, or the national capitalist. All this was imposed by looking at some personal histories of all these individuals and families of these people, and that's how they divide them into various categories. So it means that you have to. It's not that you say that you are poor. After looking at your property, after looking at your family background, the state will impose these categories on you, which means that the process of once you impose this rich classes, then whole idea of what you call self-criticism and changing into the poor classes begun. That you change into from the rich class and then transform yourself into a de-idolization, which is called that you basically say that you have been criticized, you criticize yourself that you are actually belong to the rich classes, and then slowly change into a manual labor category. For example, China has all this campaign of sending you to the countryside, or sending people. Suppose you belong to a bourgeoisie identity, they send you to work in that as a manual labor. I mean, that's how we read from the communist history. We don't know whether it's true or not. But sending you to the countryside was important. So basically the idea was that educate the people's mind. Make them to come out of this old bourgeoisie thinking. Cultural revolution was all about that, right? That you come out of this four old custom, old traditions, etc., etc. So basically the bourgeoisie political thinking has to be abolished. Which means that the idea was that the capitalist rulers, the socialist equality has to be somewhere brought in, and which can be brought in if you change your ideas. So Mao was basically trying to say is that it is the superstructure. Remember, it's not the base determining the superstructure. Rather, during the Cultural Revolution time, rather he's saying the superstructure determines the base. So the whole idea is that if you change your thinking, and that why he was doing. He was basically responding to the conflict within the party, which happened after the Great Leap Forward. That whether there should be a capitalist line of thinking, China should go to the capitalist economic production or the socialist economic production. So there was a kind of a dividing line. There was a kind of a conflict in all this set of mode of productions, or the kind of economic transformation which China should get, which never happened before the Great Leap Forward. So it was basically after the failure of Great Leap Forward, the kind of a division happened within the party itself. And Mao was responding to this kind of a division within the party by saying that we have to change the thinking. Because the idea was that he was trying to attack is that some bourgeoisie political thinking has entered into the Chinese political mindset, which we have to change. Otherwise, it will lead to a kind of a bureaucratic mechanism which Soviet Russia suffered from. So it was trying to again evolve a kind of a new model of communism for China than for other countries as such. So China, from Great Leap Forward onwards, if you look at it, China was following a model of working on two legs: agrarian industrialization, which means that we have to take care of both focusing on agriculture and industry, but he was talking about rural industrialization. And the whole idea of Great Leap Forward was basically mass mobilization to produce steel in a big way. And if you look at it in those years in China, rural courtyard was basically where the steel production took place. Of course, the failed because the steel was not in good quality, etc., etc. But for the first time, the peasantry in a huge number was mobilized to produce steel, which itself is a very kind of a unprecedented phenomenon in those years. So what I'm trying to say, come back to this, is that the state took the responsibility to decide who belong to which social classes. But these classes can be changed. If suppose you give away your property, you give away your criticism, so you can transform yourself from one class to another class. So they were not fixed categories. But according to Mao, the inequalities are basically in their mindset, which need to be completely changed. Other interesting thing he did, of course, boundaries of communities and social units, which means that, as I said, rural and the urban. And for that, he introduced two important institutions, which was one was Hukou and the was Tan. Now I can come to Hukou and Tan. Now, Hukou is a kind of a identity, social identity. If you are born in a rural areas, you are giving a kind of a Hukou social identity. So which means that your household permit is here, and according to this permit, you are actually ensured a kind of a basic entitlements of your needs and welfare packages. And which means other thing also, that your social mobility was restricted in those years, which means that you cannot go to other cities, because once you go to other cities, your Hukou has not been given to you, which means that nobody will ensure your basic welfare packages. So this was basically was kept in mind to ensure the restriction of social mobility, A. B. Make people to work to remain in the rural social spaces, and C. Very much tied to this collectivization. So you cannot think of any other independent social associations outside these rural boundaries per se. So whatever you have is within these rural boundaries. And the state introduced these new institutions, you have to work within there to get the welfare packages per se. So you cannot go out, you cannot make, and then in those years commerce was not there. So there was no system of market economy, free market. So you cannot sell your produce, etc. So you cannot think of getting cash income also. Everything was given to you by the state. But the state will ensure something back to you. This is a kind of a mechanism, hukou system, which was introduced in 1958 in China. And it's a kind of identity. So your born rural area, of course people have criticized it by saying is that is a kind of a social stratification mechanism. But I would say that China could overcome all these problems of slums and over exodus to the cities because of this particular hukou system. So I don't think that there was a problem in those years, because China was going through the earlier phase of industrialization, where sometimes this kind of restrictive measure were very important to adjust to. Other important, in urban areas they have this Tanwe system. Now Tanwe is a kind of a work unit. Suppose you work in a Tanwe is a Chinese term for work unit system, and there is various studies on that as well. And people say it's a kind of a controlling the people's life. So if you work in this factory, if you work in a particular work unit, the work unit will ensure you the social protection measures from the birth to the grave. So everything has been taken care of by this work unit. And then if you look at the earlier China, there was an urban neighborhood system. So there was a public canteen nearby, there was a school system nearby. So everything was given. It was a kind of a self-sufficient unit, which is everything was actually ensured by this Tanwe system within this kind of a social unit mechanism. So some people have criticized it by saying it's a kind of a social cellularization, which means that people were divided into various social cells, and you cannot think of your life beyond the social cell per se. So there's a different ideas on that as well, that how China has categorized people into different social units as well as different social spaces. So these were the two important institutions, which of course now have gone through a various transformation measures per se. So this also can be a part of your lecture modules, that what were the social institution mechanism, social institution which the state has introduced in those years to divide, to disaggregate the people's life into various categories, rural and the urban, or manual worker as well as the mental worker, or the city and the countryside. So these were the two important categories which were never been supposed to go beyond that. It never used to be like you cannot go outside this kind of boundary. It was very restricted kind of social spaces. So everything was within that. And some people have explained that Tanwe was a kind of a is a way of political control also. So once you're working in because urban China has been a problem for CPC from the very beginning. Because rural social life, they have got peasantry support in a big way, and they were able to introduce new mechanism. But the urban China remained a kind of mystery for them. And there was all kind of problem of bureaucratism, corruptions and all that. So to overcome that, they thought that work unit can also be kind of control mechanism for Chinese people who work there, so that you control their life through their. So basically, these are also ideas of a state surveillance. You control over them. That these are the unit system, these are the hukou system, and you control their lives through them. So this is one way of also a way of China has just liberated. So to not let the law and order go outside the state control. This is also one way to controlling the people's life, so that you know what somebody is engaging to, and also to determine who is friend of the state, who are enemy of the state. So this is some of the categories they have identified in those. And also the other interesting point was that, as I said in the earlier lecture, transformation was a very fascinating subject for them. They've taken away the power and the wealth from there, as well as the hierarchy. So you work in the unit system, but there is no hierarchy. Everybody is treated the same way. So there is no boss, there is no worker. As well as a hukou system, everybody works in the collective unit. Everybody works in the same category. Of course, people say because of mechanization there was some point system diversification, but it did not become a kind of a too difficult a problem to solve. So social equality was or you can public distribution which we don't think that it was there in China, but through this kind of a mechanism, they try to introduce this public distribution mechanism and try to ensure social equality to a large extent in those years in China. So the Cultural Revolution you will not see, but Cultural Revolution was a kind of a example where Mao Zedong, of course, people have a different interpretation of Cultural Revolution now. So people say that it's not simply a Mao Zedong alone could trigger it, unless until there was a kind of a social forces available for that. So I leave it to you. You can slowly. Yeah. So all that I already explained to you that how social mobility was not allowed, etc., etc., and then you cannot think life beyond this kind of a Hukou system, as well as other kind of any kind of a trade and exchanges which were there in those years were simply abandoned, controlled by China. So life was tied to these kind of a social institutions very much, and there was no other kind of a other institution which was there available in those years in China. Yeah. Now, so state was so powerful. You always get this idea of whether it was an authoritarian state, whether it was a totalitarian state, whether it was a one-party state. So Chinese state has been interpreted in different manners in Mao's time talking about. Right? So people say it's a totalitarian state, but I will not say it's a totalitarian state because, as I said, Chinese social forces were equally very powerful in those years. Right? So we don't call it totalitarian state power. The other we call it authoritarian state, of course, because Chinese party state was trying to dominate all part of social life. So you can say it's authoritarian. Of course, it's a party state because party was trying to control. Now, one important shift you will see is that in those years you have this term called party state, which means that party was trying to control the state as an institution. But while if you look at the studies now in 80s and 90s, you will see there was a state as an independent unit has emerged. So no longer you have this party controlling all the power of the state. Or the state also has kind of come out of this party unit per se. I'm talking about 80s and 90s. But in those years, in Mao's time, revolutionary time, post-revolutionary China, you have this term called party state, which has come to current, which also gives an indication that this party which is controlling the state doesn't have any independent power as such. Why? And for that you have to really understand NPC, CPC structure. That how CPC, China has this CPC, which is the executive agency, Politburo Standing Committee, etc., etc. Then you have NPC, National People's Congress. Then you have also CPPCC, a state council. Now NPC, if you look at it, most of the members have been appointed by the CPC. So that's how they control all the state organs as such. But with this reform, you also have a new institutions which have evolved over the years in China, and this new institution is supposed to be having a more economic power. And one important phenomenon for this is a decentralization also. So decentralization of the power from the center to the local, as well as the because of the changes in the state mechanism, you have the new institutions, which actually has changed this dynamics which used to have between the party and the state. So there's a new. I hope somebody will take it up. That how this the shift has taken place from being a party state per se to state as an independent agency which has emerged because of the economic market forces have come up in a big way in China. So you have of course, party remain powerful, but party is no longer controlling the social life. Party is actually facilitating the economic life per se, and for that they are evolving new mechanism per se. That's the one way to understand. Simplistic. Now, as state was very authoritarian in nature, what society did, they also tried to have their own channels of influence, and the conscience is a very important. Conscience is a very important mechanism to understand that how social force is very powerful in China. See, gift. There is a very important work which has been done on this gift culture in China. Banquets and gift. Whenever you go to China, there is a huge state banquets given to the foreigners as well as the host which is there in China, given to the guest. And these banquets are very very important because you understand that who is hosting you and where is the power and all that. So there's a very important party caterers and all, and they are the one who are actually taking greeting you as well as facilitating your stay as well as visiting China. So state banquets and the gift exchange of gift is also very important phenomena in social life of China. So people always carry with some kind of a social gift whenever you visit some families or some kind of a important political network as well. which is goes you very far in that sense. So public banquets, gift culture, as well as this kind of a coin sheet network. So if you want to build your coin sheet, how will you build your coin sheet? It's all through these gifts and banquets and all that. So public dining is very important phenomenon in China, and family network. So this coin sheet, in a way, it becomes such an important agency, social agency, which actually could give a challenge to somewhere the state authority. Coin sheet. Yeah, because this is a personal influence network where people could use their power against the state authority. So some of the state, so I'm talking about authoritarian state, where state has a interesting capacity to govern, and those capacity to govern can be challenged in a way by these local powers through this coin sheet network. So even if the state wants this to happen, sometimes this local state units will evade their power order through this kind of a coin sheet network. So which is also, some people have traced this phenomenon, but for that you really need to know some of the important social forces. But Mayfair Young was the important author who has covered this kind of a gift culture. So it's a challenge. So state authoritarianism and the social invasions of this person network, clientelist network, and the coin sheet, which means that somewhere if you belong to one particular region, so these regional influences or particular lineage or kinship also play a very important role in getting your promotions, job, even if the state is very powerful. That also worked very well even in those years. So I come back to the main point that the society was quite autonomous, even if the state control was there. So state trying to intervene or trying to enter into this local arena, but it has limitation. It could not challenge the local network of authority, which has been covered by various writings like Vivin Shu, Prasenjit Dwara, and to some extent even the Elizabeth Perry, which has covered all these issues, that how the local social force is very powerful in China in those. Now what happened after the reforms? Well, as I said that one interesting thing which has changed from this when the market economy has been introduced in China is a concept of mobility. So mobility, which was restricted in those years because of Hukou and Danwei, was completely being changed because of the changes in the institutions of Hukou and Danwei. So which means that no longer you have to stay in the rural area, rather you are free to move. So you have this, which has resulted into a huge, large scale rural-urban migration in China. And also people now can, not only is a physical migration, but also mobility from the one class to another class. So people are, as I said, the poverty in China is not very trapped concept. People are not into poverty trap. Rather, people are free to move from one social class to another social class. So nobody remains poor forever in China because of the state support. The state has provided such a important income earning opportunities. Income earning opportunities are either provided by some institutions or some kind of a individuals, but in case of China, it's a state which has kind of taken a lead to provide more and more opportunities for the people in the villages as well as in the cities, where people can come and earn income. So you have, for example, as I said, in rural China you have this agro-based companies where people can work there, or you can leave your land and go to the urban areas to work, or you can take more land to work. So all that, if you want to, but the complication is that the onus is on the people. The state shrug off the responsibility of social protectionism. So earlier in the Hukou and Danwei, where the state was a very powerful social protectionist agency, all that now contract has been broken. Now it's left to the individual. If you have capacity, you can work. You can earn money. If you're not earning money, it means you are not capable enough. So it means that there is a kind of a new terminology which has been introduced in case of a social life, which is social certification. Now, around 2000, 2001, Chinese sociologists, especially from the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. So if you Google it, in every province of China there is an Academy of Social Sciences. For example, Beijing Academy of Social Sciences or Guangzhou Academy of Social Sciences. Plus you have the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. And there are various sociologists and anthropologists who have been tracing this social transformation also. And they have come with this idea of a new categories of social strata. And so which means that all that terminology which Mao introduced, peasant worker, has completely changed. And now you have they have introduced some new 10 social categories. which means white collar workers, blue collar workers, factory workers, peasantry, entrepreneurs, workers. So they have this new 10 or 12 social categories, which means that now they have introduced a new term called social strata, then social classes. So social classes was abandoned after this, 1978, when the market reform was introduced by Deng Xiaoping, and Deng Xiaoping has completely abandoned this political vocabulary of Mao. So no longer you introduce mobilization, no longer you use social classes, no longer you use revolution. All that has been abandoned. Now the new category is that economic modernization, technological development, or the market economy. So these are the new terminology which has been used by. In fact, if you look at it, I'm just wanted to bring this concept here. China has this idea of a socialist market economy, which means that market economy is somewhere has been state-led in the beginning, and now somewhere state supported now. So that's why they have very interestingly used the term socialist market economy. So state is never away from this market economy. State is very much part of it. Initially, it has been in a way opened up by the state, by their state-led kind of a support, and later on it has been developed by the state person. So that's interesting dynamics you have to understand. So what is happening with the social strata? They have tried to depoliticize the social equality. So which means that earlier, if there is a kind of inequality is there in China, it was a responsibility of the state to address it. But once you just take away this class category, so which means that you say social strata, which means that you say that if you are poor, it is your problem. You are not able to participate in the market economic production, or you are not skillful enough to earn money. So the more onus is on individual to participate more profitable ventures. The state cannot ensure you anything. So it has given a new kind of a nexus between the individual and the state, which means that if there is an inequality, it is your responsibility, and B, state doesn't try to address those inequalities. So which has been criticized by various authors per se, that by using the term social strata, what Chinese state has done, Chinese state has tried to depoliticize all the social inequalities by saying that social inequalities very much is a kind of an individual responsibility, is no longer a state responsibility. So with this new introduction of social stratification debate paradigm, which has began in China from 2000 onwards, there is a new debate happening in China, and the social inequalities no longer exist. It's basically a individual based kind of a hierarchy, which means that it is you are not able to participate equally. So which means that more onus is now, for example, people who have lost job because there was a kind of an enterprise adjustment. Earlier China has SOEs, state-owned enterprises, but with this new market economy you have various kind of enterprise, which means private enterprises, private capital has entered a big way. So which has completely changed the mode of work patterns. So earlier the work protectionism was there, which means that you are working from life to death. But now you have a more flexible mode of employment, which means that you can be hired and fired anytime. Now this, which means that it is the more responsibilities to the factory bosses as well as the labor and their equations. The state doesn't figure in anywhere. While in the Tanvi system, the state used to be the main important agency there. So all that has changed. Depoliticization of the entire social life, which means that inequalities is no longer the state responsibility. Of course, the state always addresses party. If you look at the party document from the 14th Party Congress, state now recently finished the 19th Party Congress. It talks about social harmony, political stability, etc., etc. But the whole idea is that for Chinese state is how to govern these social inequalities. That is the only challenge they have. Otherwise, they don't think that they have to address these social inequalities. They only look at that how they can actually make people to think of their ways that in which they can participate in the market economic production. So that is a big change which has happened. And what Chinese state has done, they have of course created a new network of exchanges, new income earning opportunities, and expansion of market. So which means that it's liberalized. And I explained to you just now, the land was one example, labor is another example, commodification of all this production mechanism, which means that you are free to earn money the way you want. The state doesn't restrict you any longer. But the state doesn't take responsibility. So what they have done, they have abandoned the social classes, but they have introduced a new spatial hierarchy. What is spatial hierarchy? rural urban, or backward regions versus very coastal regions. Now coastal regions are very advanced regions, which has seen prosperity much earlier in 78. So if you look at Shenzhen, Guangzhou and all, they are very advanced coastal regions because of the opening up of these regions much earlier. But if you look at the interior China western regions, according to the eastern region standard, they are not that advanced. But according to my standard, I would say they are still very advanced, very developed. If you look at, if you travel to those regions. So they have these kind of hierarchies now. People who are living in the advanced as well as vis-a-vis the interior western regions, or people who are living in the rural region and the urban region. But the classes hierarchy has been completely abandoned. So you have no new special hierarchy. Or Hukou as well as Danwei, they have now liberalized. So you can move wherever you want. But the state will not ensure you anything. So all this debate of citizenship rights have emerged, that if you're moving to the cities, but you are not a city worker. So what the state does, the state try to make some laws. Okay, so these laws will take care of all this aspect. But the implementation part of the law, we don't know about it. So there is all kind of problems with that. So what the state is trying to do, the state is trying to maintain a balance between the authority of the state, market forces, and the social groups. And what they're trying to do is that they're trying to somehow use it or try to solve it by introducing this mechanism of A, NGOs, B, associations, C, law. Right? So this is the new categories they have introduced. So I come to this social associations now. Now, lawyers have become a very important category in China. And you will see in various cities that they have opened their offices and they are actually doing kind of practices. So it means that public interest litigation cases. And public interest litigation cases can be against consumer protection rights, against public officials, party cadres. So now the state actually gives this right to the people, that if they are unhappy against any kind of a situation in their locality, they can go and file the public interest litigation cases against the public official as well. So they are trying to indicate a message, especially with this new Xi Jinping regime, that the party is not above the law. And their reasons, you must have heard of corruption, the huge rampant corruption in the last 5 years, 10 years, and Xi Jinping is trying to address it by saying that we have to cleanse the political system, and that is possible if we put nothing, nobody is beyond the law. So it means that you will see a kind of, again, a social force is very vibrant, talking about that we are not happy against it, so we have a right to get something. Pollution, suppose Beijing there is a pollution, and we have heard of this pollution, so people have a right to go and say against the municipal authorities that we want a change in that. Something which you don't see much in India. If there is a traffic violation, nobody goes to where. If there is a problem with the pollution, nobody is going anywhere. But that's something which is happening in China, very resilient kind of a society which has this mechanism to go and fight it out. That we are not, for example, there was a petrochemical plant somewhere, and petrochemical plant was actually polluting the water and all. And this kind of a local authority has actually gone ahead and filed a complaint against that. So environmental protection become a kind of a phenomena which need to address by these by these people in a big way, and they have been doing it. So public interest litigation cases has become a much important phenomena of this. So social protest is one, public interest litigation second, and third, you also have this law schools, which has come up in China in a big way. So universities have this various legal mechanism where people are not legally unaware. They know about their rights. So right consciousness has very much emerged in China after the reform, and they are going and filing a case and suing against the public officials, etc., that our rights and demands are not fulfilled. So that much freedom people have enjoyed. So again you will see a kind of a renegotiation of this social space. So though you say that we are not responsible for social inequality, state says that we are not responsible for what you're going through. If you're going through unequal power of wealth or property, is your problem. But the society is negotiating by making this kind of associations. So you have association of various kinds: consumer associations, professional, journalists, lawyers, self-employed group, farmers, women. Or not only in those years of China there was an official organization. For example, I talk about Women's Federation and all. But now you have various independent organization as well. So you have various NGOs. Only thing is that the NGOs you understand now in China is very different from India. In case of China, you have to register the NGOs, and they don't enjoy so much of financial autonomy. So financial autonomy also has been, in a way, restricted by the state. So in a way, you can say that they don't have independent NGOs. So civil society kind of a mechanism is not there much in China. But what Chinese state has done, that people can actually use these NGOs to address their grievances, to articulate their grievances against the state authority. And these NGOs can actually go to the state and say that these are the sections demands and that you somewhere have to accommodate them. So that become a kind of a, so they never become a resistance or a kind of an independent force, but they're working with the state to legitimize the state power by making the society to feel that their interests will be also be accommodated. This is the kind of a dynamism you have to understand. So it never works against the state. It legitimizes the state authority. Why? How? Because they say that, okay, you have problem, we articulate your grievances, and somewhere the state promises to accommodate those interests. For example, I gave you, one example I gave you, in 2014, I think China has come up with a anti-domestic violence law. By all these NGOs effort. The domestic violence is not very much rampant in China. But the very fact that they will not let even tolerate any kind of violence, which has made the state to accept that, okay, we'll make a kind of a first anti-domestic violence law person. Actually, women in China are much more active, much more empowered. But because of their effort, this kind of a violence law has happened. But in India, you have whole lot of laws and violence, but it never changed into kind of a social reality. So what I'm trying to understand this kind of a dynamics. So it means that you have a more social activism. Now this is a kind of a new phenomenon which many studies have worked on this. That you have again a very kind of a active society, active social forces. Even after expanded market relations, even after you have more economic freedom, society has not become passive. Rather, society has become somewhere renegotiating with the state. That okay, we are not happy with this part, so you take care of these interests as well. The state is saying that it is all happening because of market, but still they're going ahead and fighting a case against this local public official, for example. So the new terminology of discrimination, which was never there in Mao's time, has been introduced. So people are fighting against the discrimination, for example, if they think that they have been discriminated against. Then public interest. Public interest also become a new phenomena, that what you do is not in the right in the favor of public interest. So sometimes the state policy have to address those public interests. Suppose they try to bring some kind of power plant or chemical plant, they have to see that the public interest has also been fulfilled. Then this whole idea of a legal redressal mechanism, that if the laws has become a kind of a powerful social force in the hands of the people, that they can go and fight against the state forces person. But it never, as I said, that state has allowed these kind of associations to come up. So it never becomes a challenge to the state power. Rather, somewhere they are increasing the capacity of the state to govern. So governance has become a new phenomenon, especially after the market reforms, where the state realized that they have to open up various sections. It's no longer a party, civil society, a small unit, which used to be the Mao's time. Rather, you have here a much more forces which are entering into it. So in that case, how to govern, the problems of, for example, women's protest, or the social protest, migrant women's workers protest, or the environmental protest, or the ethnic minority. So these have become a challenge or headache for the state. So to do that, so to increase the governing capacity, it is actually a kind of a very much reality for the Chinese state. And what they did to address this, they have of course introduced a new institutions, some of the new institutions which can address those issues, and this social associations, NGOs, and interesting is that informal networks. China has very interesting magazines, which actually works as a kind of, or you can say that what you call the the helplines, which actually work as a kind of a network to associate people and make them to articulate their interests. For example, in women's area, for example, I know that they have very informal kind of a women magazines which works on website platform, where you can actually outreach to all these women, for example, farmers who have been not given land rights, and they have been writing letters to them. And through these writing letters, they become a platform through which they can articulate their interest. So website platforms, this helplines, or this customer care, all these are very important phenomena, social phenomena in China, where they're trying to address and articulate the local interest in significant manners. Education. Education is a very interesting example where Chinese state has actually somewhere empowered this local ethnic minority rights to educate in bilingual. So in your local language vis-a-vis in the Han language as well. Of course, but that is only possible for the school education. But for the higher education as well, they have certain categories of local languages passing out some program as well. But if they want to enter into the mainstream job, somewhere they have to learn get into this mainstream development program. But if you look at the important administrative positions, people from all kind of ethnic backgrounds are there. So what I'm trying to say is that it's no longer an open tussle between state and society. And why it did not happen in China? Because China has evolved a kind of mechanism where the state has been forced to listen to the social interest. Why? Because society has always negotiated, and that is possible when you have very active social forces from within, which can always talk about that what happened to their social interests, what happened to the social rights, public interests, litigation cases, law schools, etc., etc. So that has become possible because you have this kind of a negotiation which happened in those years. Okay. Now, so the point which I want to bring, to this, and after that I go to some of these photographs, is that I'm not saying that society everything is very peaceful in China. There are social conflicts of all kinds, but the interesting point is that Chinese state is able to manage those social conflicts. So it never becomes as like he talked about Falun Gong kind of an independent parallel state administration which can give a challenge to the state. That is one. And how did they able to? Why they think it's important to manage the social conflict? Because they know that they have to increase their capacity to govern. The governing capacity, governance has become a challenge to Chinese state now. And if you look at from the 16th Party Congress even till now, they mentioned in their party documents that how governance has become a kind of a important something which they have to address. And why? Because local authorities, even in the provincial, prefecture, municipal level, are more powerful. Because what happened after 1978 is local administration has given more autonomy to invest, to attract investment, as well as to take independent decisions. And to accommodate those kind of a local interests, what Chinese state is actually two minds. A, they have to adjust the development needs of the people. Chinese society is becoming kind of very aspirational society. Nobody wants to live in poverty. Nobody wants to earn less income. Everybody wants to reach to a higher level. So as people say, China dream has become an American dream. People want to have a huge villas. There's a housing sector reforms in a big way. Now nobody lives in a kind of a urban housing mechanism where you have this giving a kind of a small courtyard. Now Chinese housing system has more villas, independent housing, more luxurious apartments. So this all become a reality of Chinese housing because there was a change in the housing sector reform, and people have a desire, people have aspirations to move in a kind of those housing, as well as getting higher education. Most of the Chinese are going abroad for US as well as other countries to getting their children to higher education, get higher education, English. So there is a desire to learn English. So there is a desire to move to the upper stratum of the society, which is very much Chinese people want. And for that, somewhere the state is actually in a kind of a tensions. There is a structural tension within the state as such. To attract, to respond to these development aspirations of the society, and which Chinese state has to do, because party says that we are there for you. Party is for the people. Party has to take care of the people's interests, and party is actually working on because it gets legitimacy of the people per se, right? So party has to keep showing that every 5 years that they have given something to the people. So aspirations, development aspiration is very much part of the people's life, which somewhere they have to address. So therefore they are liberalizing various sectors, income earning opportunities, give them more freedom, commerce, housing sector reform, etc., etc., work flexible employment, etc. Second, what they are also trying to do is that the major contradiction also is that once they attract to the development aspiration of people, there is also a local provincial economy. So political cadres have their own motives sometimes. So they want to put their own motives, but they also have to look at the people's interest. So somewhere state has to maintain a balance between this local motivations, economic interests vis-a-vis the people's development motives. So that has become I would say, a big challenge for the state capacity to govern that, how to do it. So they are thinking of various independent mechanisms, various forces which can take care of all this, somewhere the problems which has emerged. For example, I gave you women. Women are entering into all kind of sectors now, from factory to bar hostesses to any kind of a restaurant, bar hostesses to beauty parlors to all kind of workers. Now, in this kind of a sections, there is all kind of a new vulnerabilities which somewhere the state has to address. But the whole thing is that social groups are no longer victimized. So I don't want to portray any social group as a kind of victim forces per se. Rather, they are very active and very motivated about their interests per se. So that is something is if I just want to conclude this particular theme is that state capacity to govern more social forces, activism from within, and then this governance and the active society, somewhere the state has tried to maintain a balance by introducing new social mechanisms like NGOs, association life, as well as legal activism per se. But it is not getting resolved. So there is still a kind of the problems to come, like how to manage, because Chinese society is becoming more and more aspirational society. So that will may become a challenge, I'm saying, in the years to come, that how to take care of interests of every social group per se, which Chinese state is trying very hard to do it by accommodating people's interests in various ways. But that is still remain a kind of a phenomenon which they need to address in the years to come. Now what I do, I show you some of the photographs about this rural social transformation. This is a very important flower. Yunnan has been known as the flower kingdom, and flower market in Taunan, which is very near to Kunming. Kunming is a capital of Yunnan, and flower kingdom in Taunan flower market is actually Asia's largest flower market. So I'm talking about how the rural China, the transformation has begun, where the rural peasantry are looking at beyond their boundaries to the international market now. So this is the transformation. So I visited those much earlier, 15 years back, where they have very local kind of a flower market, where people are actually selling flowers, and especially women are more active in their sector. Not because that they are considered to be soft, rather because they are considered to be more independent economic actors per se. Actually, the entire family is supposed to is becoming engaging in this cash crop production, which has become a kind of very economically profit-making orientation enterprise in those areas. And if you look at some of the villages which I went in 2000 to 2005, where this market is quite vibrant. You see all age group can actually come out of the market, and this market was close to the village, where people could took a kind of a small auto rickshaw kind of a thing and can reach there with their flowers. And these are the household where you have all these facilities, so it is not looked that poor because they have a pakka kind of house. Now you look at it. So this is a new transformation in this. Last year I visited, last year in May, where they are trying to make this flower market into kind of a complete industrial park. So you have now Chinese social transformation of village stories are no longer talking about only the localized market, rather they're trying to change into a kind of an industrial park as such. So you have and the localized market also they have changed into a kind of a big mechanized as well as a highly state control, where people have to enter through some registration, as well as only some kind of a important people who pass out certain quality check can enter to sell their flowers. So it's basically they have a market outside, within China, all over the provinces, as well as outside China as well. And then due to the perishability, of course, of the flowers, they have to think of the transportation and all that. So huge capital has been involved. So it was initiated from the peasant, but this all got the state support, where they have planned into this kind of a huge market per se, and then they're trying to change into a industrial park where they're trying to provide other kind of facilities as well. And then this is the rural countryside which was there in 2002-2003, and now after 10 years you will see a complete transformation, big malls, multi-story apartments and huge real estate companies, and which is not possible, I would say, without the support of the state. So all that transformation which began from this earlier localized market to this new urban transformation, which I am talking about in the earlier lecture, where you have this, so all that village which was there, of course they have tried to change those kind of a, they have not, they have tried to mechanize, or as well as I say, upgrade that market by, as I just showed you in the earlier picture, by giving the state land to that, and also inviting the more agro-based companies for that purposes. But like that localized market, everybody cannot enter in those areas, so there has to be kind of regulations on that. But what they have done is that they have completely transformed and make it more profit oriented. So what is happening is that now the local, as I said, administration, they have this right, they have this freedom to attract the investment as well as change this rural consumer kind of a small unit agrarian production to a big industrial urban transformed kind of a social unit. So you have this real estate market which has come in a big way, and the houses are actually quite well. It was, and now it is like this. And the airport is also going from that direction. So you get a huge airport if you go further line. So it means that because of the airport construction, the land of the farmer, of course, has been taken away in a big way. But then compensation packages also has been introduced to that. But the transformation, the way it looks like now, which was never used in 2002.